let me do that. Okay. There we go. All right, part 3. Here we go. Medieval times. So the period of the Rishonim. So Rishonim means the first ones, the early ones. So as the Gaonic era, centered in modern-day Iraq, came to a close, new, vibrant Jewish communities emerged in North Africa and in Europe. Right. And so, like I said, there's Jews all over, well, not so much in the New World yet at this point, but all over the not Americas, the rest of the world that isn't the New World. But a lot of what we're going to concentrate on, we're going to go from that center of Babylonian Jewish life to Mediterranean, basically, is where a lot of the medieval Jewish record, I guess, really comes from. So 11th century, we've got significant rabbinic scholarship flourishing from communities in the Mediterranean and Europe. This extensive development of scholarship endured throughout the Middle Ages and came to be known as the period of the Rishonim. So, for example, books like this, hold on, let me. This is a modernized or anglicized sort of traditional study Bible, I guess is how you might call it, that you would open it up and you can see the formatting is kind of similar to like a Talmudic page, where the central text is in the middle, and then all around it is commentary. But in this case, instead of being the central text being Talmud, it's actually Torah. And then these around the edges, these are the Rishonim. That's almost always who's around this kind of book, these commentators' Bibles. We call them, well, this is called the Mikra'ot Gedolot, but we call that study Parshanut, the idea of reading Torah with Rashi being probably the most famous example of the Rishonim. But those types of guys, the early medieval Torah commentators. So Rashi is Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, born in France in 1040 CE. Rashi wrote the definitive commentary for the whole Bible, and the Mishnah and most of the Talmud. He was quite prolific, and a lot of his stuff is like, I mean, it is just really good. It's clear understandings. He makes, especially like, he did the Talmud, or sorry, he did his biblical commentary before his Talmudic commentary, or at least his Torah he did before doing any of the Talmud. But a lot of his Torah commentary invokes the Talmud, and he gives like good citations for Midrash and things like that like a lot of the other Rishonim, not that they don't do that, but like, Nachmanides and Ibn Ezra, for example, are very they're very like grammatical and into like the word choices and things like that, and they're not as big on the Midrash. So Rashi's big on the Midrash, and he tells you where he gets it from, which I appreciate that even, they didn't have like a concept of works cited or bibliographies back then, but he knew that it was right to give credit where he got his stuff from. And he's so central that actually I just heard of this controversy. It's pretty small, I guess, the number of people that would care about this, but there a new Bible with translation and commentary was printed relatively recently in a traditional, like it's a geared toward a fairly traditional look at the Bible. although I guess not that orthodox because it is translated, and it doesn't have Rashi. And so the Haredi are mad that this is being pushed as like an orthodox, you know, um Bible with commentary, and Rashi's not one of the commentary, and they're like, well, that's just wrong. Like his is the commentary, and so they're boycotting the book. Which is kind of funny. Anyway, there you go. There's Rabbi Shlomo.
So, Rabbi,
Yes.
so are the commentators in this new version mostly modern? Is that why they left out Rashi, or?
No, they're just other, I think they're just other medieval commentators that don't get as much airtime, that these publishers thought like, let's look at them.
They do.
Yeah. Okay. So here's some other examples of scholars of the Rishonim era. Rabbeinu Gershom, who issued decrees prohibiting polygamy, reading other people's will, and divorce against a woman's will. So he was a very legal-minded rabbi. Rabbeinu Gershom was a German rabbi, I believe. He was more on in the land of Ashkenaz than the more southern parts of the Mediterranean. So his decree really only affected Ashkenazi Jews. And although eventually the rest of like Southern Europe and North Africa adapted that as well, or at least parts of North Africa, a lot of the Middle Eastern Jewish communities continued to practice polygamy until they were all kicked out of their countries and they moved to Israel, and Israel didn't allow polygamy. But like up until the 60s, a lot of Middle Eastern Jews continued to have polygamy in their communities. Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra, as I mentioned, he's one of the very like grammatically minded commentators on the Torah, although he has interesting Nachmanides can be like, he's grammatical and he can kind of like drone on with things like, I'm like, I don't understand, because I can read the Hebrew, but I can't like really read the Hebrew. So the things that he's pointing out kind of go over my head. Ibn Ezra will point out like interesting word choices, or like why is this word repeated, or things like that you can still kind of get in the translation. So I like his commentaries. And he fought against the Karaite movement, which the Karaites were a movement that actually go back as far as the Second Temple, but they remained fairly small. And anytime they started to gather any kind of foothold, there would be someone in the rabbinic community to fight against them. But they reject rabbinic authority. They claim to be, more literal readers of Torah, which, as I've said, I don't really think you can read the Torah literally at all. So they end up with their own explanations and commentaries and, interpretations to get through the things that are contradictory or missing details or whatever. But so they have their own set of halakha and authorities that they are outside of rabbinic Judaism. And they still exist today. They still remain a very small group, and they are mostly based out of, or have historically been mostly based out of, Egypt. And then Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, of course, Maimonides or Rambam, wrote a lot of stuff. He wrote the codification of the Jewish law in the Mishnah Torah. He also wrote a commentary on the Mishnah, responsa to numerous communities, and a work of philosophy entitled The Guide for the Perplexed. So the Guide for the Perplexed is, it's very philosophical. It doesn't read like commentary on the Bible, but it does include so much quotations from the Bible that you could still use it as a pretty interesting, like you could read it as midrash, because he basically goes through and like picks out every time an anthropomorphic adjective is used for God, or descriptor, you know, God's nose, God reached out God's hand, in anything like that, and then explains why it's a metaphor and God doesn't have a nose or a body or a hand or whatever. So there's definitely some good Torah commentary, but on the whole, it's written like as a letter to his philosophy student, and also talks a lot about the difference between a prophet and uh, a prophet and a philosopher, and I don't know, he has all these categories of different types of spiritual authority. That's like, it's hard to grasp, but it's an interesting concept. And then but then the other works, the commentary on the Mishnah Torah, those are much more legal and like straightforward. And you know, I like to make fun of him because his introduction to the Mishnah Torah says like, this is the only Jewish book you'll ever need ever again. I've done all of the reading and distilled it here for you. And it's so arrogant, but it is actually like it is a great work of codified Jewish law. It does simplify things quite a bit. It's pretty easy to read in translation, and it still holds today. I mean, it's not the last Jewish book we ever needed, obviously, but his halachic rulings, or his codifications, have held pretty well for the last 1,000 years. So it is pretty impressive. There's Maimonides. Okay, and then Nachmanides. He's another example. He's fairly contemporary with Maimonides. Also a philosopher, a physician, an astronomer. They all were like, you know, real true Renaissance men, you know. But he had a slightly different style. And he, a central figure in public disputation. He was one of these Jews. This happened a lot. Actually, it happened more even earlier than this period, but then happened a lot again throughout Spain, like the lead up to the Inquisition and things like this, where church fathers or various Catholic or Christian political leaders would stage these debates that were, I mean, they're called polemics. I'm not sure exactly what the like definition of a polemic is, because I've heard it used in other contexts. So I don't know if that's a helpful to say that, but where they were like kind of true debates, I guess, and like the rabbis that would step up to them were you know, would do their best to accurately defend Judaism and like participate in good faith. But for the most part, they were really attempts to undermine Judaism, to force conversion, and to stir up animosity from the public, to witness these debates and like witness the Jew denounce Christ, and so they weren't great. But Nachmanides bravely participated in a few of them. There's some good sketches on Yehudim Bayim of that as well. I love the Nachmanides sketches. They're among my favorites on that this Israeli sketch comedy show I'm sure you've heard me mention before. There's a lot of them in various contexts where people think Nachmanides is Maimonides, and he keeps saying, "No, I'm not Rambam, I'm Ramban." And then there's also one where he's at this debate, and even the like moderator thinks that he's Rambam, and he's like, "That's not who does these." Anyway. Okay, so there's Ramban. All right, and then this is also the era of Kabbalah. So some Jewish mysticism goes back a little further. we don't know exactly when the Sefer Yetzirah is written. That's the first book of Jewish mysticism. Probably 9th, 10th century. It's a little hard to trace. It's credited to someone from the 3rd century who almost definitely did not write it. So it's, it's kind of written in a way that's like clearly intentionally, like someone seems to be writing in a version of Hebrew that was old even for them at the time. Like, it's hard to explain, but like imagine someone now trying to write Old English and like it doesn't come naturally, and that's not really the same English we speak now, and there would be weird inaccuracies, and it would just be kind of a jumble. So that's kind of how Sefer Yetzirah reads to true linguist scholars. So we're not sure exactly when that's from, but the Zohar definitely comes from this period, and that becomes sort of the main book of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, and sort of the advent of Kabbalah as its own, I don't know, entity or like school of thought. So, and again, credited to someone that almost for sure didn't really write it. Although I heard a theory a couple years ago that was like, we look at it now and we're like, well, it says it's in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but we know he didn't write it. And that makes us like suspicious of Rabbi Moshe de Leon or like Isaac Luria, the proponents of this, who it kind of gives like I don't want to say that, actually, that's rude. But it gives like sort of like faker vibes, charlatan vibes. And then I heard a theory a couple years ago that was like, well, maybe they weren't trying to pass it off as true. Like they weren't trying to say that they found this lost text of these ancient rabbis. Like maybe if at the time it was intended to be written as like a parable, and everybody reading it at the time knew it wasn't really written by Rabbi. Like this isn't some secret we unlocked through our linguistics. It's like it got lost in translation over the years, and we've rediscovered it. But the people reading it at the time in the 12th century or 13th century rather, like maybe they knew all along. And I like that better. Okay. Zohar, the Book of Splendor. Why aren't you turning? There we go. Okay. Did that? Yeah. All right. Woof. This time period, rough for the Jewish people. Two new forms. Okay, so anti-Semitism in this context is anachronistic. That's not the term that would have been used. That term is a like Enlightenment era term that we'll get to. But anti-Jewish slander against the Jewish people in the medieval period. Some of this goes back like to the advent of Christian Europe, but it definitely reached a height in the medieval, in the Middle Ages. So the blood libel that Jews use non-Jewish children to bake matzah on Passover, and the desecration of the host, the slander that Jews were stealing the cracker, the communion wafer, and desecrating it, and then putting it back so that the one that Christians would receive is not truly the body of Christ. This is also pre Reformation still, so this is like in an era of transubstantiation where you know, this idea that we were desecrating the host is like we were actively desecrating the body of Christ, you know. So it was a pretty bad accusation. Both of these, you know, would lead to violence and blood libel, maybe just because it like runs off the tongue more easily. I feel like gets a lot more airtime in how we like in popular imagination and in how we talk about these historically. But desecration of the host was considered a bigger or yeah, a bigger problem, a more common sin, and would lead to it led to more bloody pogroms for Jews in medieval Europe. Yeah, it's a burning of the Jews in 1338. Lots of violence against Jews at this time. There were various forms, even before we get to the Inquisition, besides these pogroms that were in response to these libel. There also was like during the Crusades, they would just kind of get like swept up in violence as the Crusaders would come across Europe on their way from England to the Holy Land. They would just like burn down Jewish villages on their way, like just for fun. I don't know. It was not part of the plan per se. It wasn't part of the organized like crusade from the Pope, but also neither did he denounce it. You know, and it just sort of happened frequently. And then we get to the Inquisition. So during the 1300s, the Catholic Church encouraged a campaign against heretics of the Catholic faith. While this matter did not include Jews, eventually it was applied to Jews who had converted to Christianity. And by the way, that like it did apply to Jews in that they were forced often. And then of course by the end of the 14th century, by the end of the 15th century, when the expulsion was signed, you know, then it was for sure Jews had to leave or convert. And but even if they converted, they were never really safe because then they'd be under the eye of the Inquisition always. It would the Inquisition was a particularly cruel institution. Seems a redundant thing to say. Okay, children were tortured to extract confessions from their parents. Parents were tortured to extract confessions from children. Jews were burned alive at the stake, and the burnings were known as auto de fe. I learned recently that the phrase "blood is thicker than water" comes from this. That it doesn't mean like family thick and thin the way we use it now. The blood in that phrase refers to the blood of Christ, and that it was that you should turn in your family or whoever for the sake of the Inquisition, for the sake of, you know, saving souls and whatever. Spanish Jews pleading before King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella, and Grand Inquisitor. So connecting this a little bit to the Rishonim, Maimonides, yeah, that guy, he was born in Spain under the Muslim rule, and when the conquistadors took Spain back, he fled because it was so violent in Iberia under the Catholic monarchs that a great many Jews fled to North Africa, or they fled to Portugal, and then Portugal also, like, then the Inquisition reached there, and then they fled to Amsterdam, and then they fled to England. They fled to a lot of places, but a lot of them just went to Arab lands because they had already been living under the ones from Maimonides' era anyway, from the the time of the conquest. They had already been living under Muslim rule, and they knew sort of what to expect. So, okay, and then as I said, 1492, the expulsion. All Jews were required to be out of Spain by Tish B'Av. So that's also when we mark the destruction of both temples, and the expulsion from England in 1090, whatever year it was, 1090 something. That was the 5th of Av, 12th of Av, something. It was in the same week, so that gets lumped in too. In 1516, the first official ghetto was established in Venice, Italy. The term ghetto comes from Ghetto Nuovo, or New Foundry, a walled area where the church and local Venice businessmen forced Jews to live. Jews were generally permitted to leave the walls of the ghetto during the day, and at night they were locked in the ghetto. In medieval Europe, ghettos were as much for Jewish safety as they were about segregation. Like, Jews were facing so much violence from the townspeople, and like Jewish villages, like farm villages and whatever, were at risk of just being like set on fire at any time. That the ghettos were really the walled cities kept them safe as much as it kept them oppressed. I mean, it did both. Like, I'm not denying that it was also oppressive, but it kept vigilantes out. If vigilante is even the right word, that makes it sound like they were justified, but you know what I mean. All right, post-expulsion, the 16th century. This is like the broadest overview of medieval Jewish history there, but you know, we're doing what we can in an hour. The center of Jewish life moved from French and German-speaking lands to Poland. Invited to Poland by Polish royalty, together with wealthy nobles, Jews prospered in a vibrant economy, but not for long. The Jewish life flourished also in the Ottoman Empire. The city of Safat attracted Kabbalists and mystics. Yes, a lot in the 1600s. It started, again, like in 1492, a great many of, or even, you know, in the late 1400s, a great many Jews fleeing the Inquisition also went to the Holy Land, and wrote poems about how they missed Spain. So, you know, what is the Jewish homeland remains a complicated question. But so those that had already established some community, it really became a stronghold for Kabbalists and mystics. And so in the 1600s, the city of Safat really flourished as this mystical city. So Luria, as I said, is very much associated with the Zohar and teaching the Zohar, and sort of like the father of Kabbalah as we know it today. Shlomo Alkabetz was a Kabbalist and mystic, and wrote the famous Lachad Dodi and some other poems as well. This is the period of Kabbalat Shabbat, like this idea of creating these welcoming psalms and a time period to like ease your soul into the Shabbat service and not just go straight into the Baruch Hu. This is the time and place that happens. Is the 1600s Sfat. And Joseph Caro also compiled the Shulchan Aruch at this time, another authoritative compendium of Jewish law. So it rivals the Mishnah Torah as like the main codification of halacha that we still use today. And I think I've mentioned before that so Shulchan Aruch means the set table, and Moshe Isserles was a Polish Jew who then wrote the Mapa, or the tablecloth, which is his gloss on the Shulchan Aruch, where anything that is like too Sephardic, Moshe Isserlis comes in and says like, well, we do this a little differently in Poland and things like that, and kind of gives the comparison. But instead of writing his own book of Jewish law that would have a lot of the same stuff, he just kind of like gives the gloss, and it's very helpful to see like side by side comparisons of the two main Jewish communities of the time and how much they still did have in common, but where things differed. I've been in that synagogue. All right, the Khmelnytsky pogroms. This is a big one. This is often referred to as like the first pogrom. I'm not sure what it is about that word that means like if it's specific to Poland, and like that's why it has that title, because there were obviously other, as I mentioned, all these other massacres that I would call pogroms throughout medieval Europe with the blood libel and the desecration of the host libel. But this one was a big one. Maybe because it was the first really instigated by like state leadership, not just, you know, the priest or the mayor or whatever of a small town, but it was really like it was a big deal. Instigated by the monarchy or the nobles. I don't know if they had a monarchy per se. In and left over 100,000 Jews dead in 1648 and 49. And then Shabbatai Tzvi, disaster of the false Messiah, didn't lead to as many deaths. It did lead to some. I mean, there were holdouts that continued to like try to rebel against the Sultan, you know, in his name, and they were killed, but there wasn't any big there wasn't anything like a pogrom where there was just like wanton violence in the streets over it. But what really distressed people was that Shabbatai Tzvi converted to Islam. Like they thought he was the Messiah, and when given the choice to convert or die, instead of being martyred, as you might think a Messiah would do, he just converted and like completely turned his back on Jews. Like he didn't even address his followers. He just went and lived his Muslim life. And that was pretty disappointing to people. And then he was followed, one of his followers, Jacob Frank, then declared himself the Messiah. And then it really loses the thread. And I don't even know all the details of it because it hurts my brain to read of it. But like he was a crazy person who started like a cult. Jacob Frank, not Shabbatai Tzvi. But it was a direct result from Shabbatai. All right, and then we've got the rise of Hasidism. So I've said before, I think Hasidism really is the first reform that in the 18th century, the Baal Shem Tov came to inspire a movement known as Hasidism. He emphasized spontaneity in worship, popularization of Kabbalah, and establishing a close relationship to a righteous person or a Rebbe. It also, like in this, you know, vein, in the, you know, for the sake of spontaneity and mysticism and close personal connection with the divine, there was a lot of you know, ecstatic worship that hadn't really ever been a part of Judaism before. The creation of nigunim comes from this movement. You know, singing and dancing and drinking. The Kiddush Club comes from this this movement. So it was a very joyous approach to God. And the not Hasidim at the time were called Misnagdim or Mitnagdim. In modern Hebrew, it would be a T, but I guess you know, Hasidism comes from Poland, so they would say misnagdim. Um, but I've never heard anyone use that term outside of this time period. Like, you know, now we still do have Hasidim and non-Hasidic Orthodox Jews, but I've never heard the non-Hasidic Orthodox Jews refer to themselves as mitnagdim. And I mentioned that recently, like in a part of a presentation I was giving, and the other Jewish educator on the call with me was like, yeah, I've never even heard that term. And I was like, well, that's a problem actually, that you're a Jewish educator of history and you don't know that term. But it left me still unanswered, that I don't know what happened to that term and why it seems to have died out. But anyway, because there are still, not all Orthodox Jews are Hasidic.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
the separation of men and women that we associate now with Hasidism, did that predate them? Did it start at the beginning of, I mean, with all this joyous stuff that they were at the beginning that was so important? Did you know what I'm asking?
Yeah, separation of men and women goes back to the earliest days of synagogues.
But to
It
that
predates.
extreme, but I thought it was, I mean, it's so extreme with the
I
Hasidim.
think it just seems more extreme because of how joyous the men get, and that
Okay.
the women aren't allowed in, like
Well,
in a in like Rashi's synagogue, for example, if we can imagine, where all of the men are, you know, reading quietly and mumbling and shuckling and just doing their prayers like straightforward and, you know, following the leader, and the women are in the balcony doing the same thing, they would still be separated, but you, like, they're doing the same thing. As
right,
opposed to then in a Hasidic synagogue where the men are dancing and they're holding hands and they're doing the hora and they're singing and they're taking a shot between, not during services itself probably, but like before or after. Um, and the women are still just sitting there quietly, like mumbling the prayer, like, you know, so it looks a lot more dramatic. But
okay.
the actual separation has was always in effect until, or I guess I shouldn't say always. I'm sure there were some communities throughout history that
Right.
had,
We
but
learned about those here and there, but from the very beginning of Hasidism, that was the men were allowed to be joyful and the women couldn't because it might distract the men from their joyousness. Yeah.
right,
Yeah. Okay.
it would turn their joyousness into lewdness.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah. Okay, and then the Vilna Gaon in 1720. Uh, yeah, okay, I said that right. It took me. Anyway, um, he established Torah study as the pinnacle of religious endeavor. He was a vocal opponent of the Hasidic movement, concerned about the lack of emphasis on actual Torah study, and disturbed about the reliance on a charismatic leader, the Rebbe. So he would have been a misnaged. Um, he also was a big proponent of Talmud study. I don't know if that's like, if Torah study here is meant to be kind of euphemistic for all Jewish study, but he was a big Talmud dude. There's the Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon. The Baal Shem Tov stories are very um delightful, and it seems like maybe the Rebbe's, like, you know, got lost along the way a little bit in what it means to be a charismatic leader. But anyway, there we go. The gravestone of the Baal Shem Tov, the exterior synagogue. I'm not even going to try to say the name of his town, but there it is. um, and although his shul, the original, was destroyed by the Nazis, an exact replica has been erected on its site as a museum, which is, that's good. The Lozhen Yeshiva, a disciple of the Vilna Gaon by Chaim Volozhin. I always thought it was because the town name was Volozhin. Isn't there a town named Volozhin in Poland? Okay, so that's the I want to look at the timeline too, because sometimes there are slightly different things on these timelines, and I realized I forgot to do that last time. Oh, but first, does anybody have any other questions on what I just zoomed through?
Rabbi, why is there a monumental, no, I'm using the wrong term, a huge statue of the Rambam in Madrid?
Because that's where he was born.
I see. That's
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Mhm.
And then he left. Did
And
most of his writing in Alexandria, I think. I can't remember if it's Alexandria or Cairo. I'm pretty sure it's Alexandria.
okay. And our pictures, our the beaming of our presence was
Yes.
blocked my view of the desecration of the host. Could you please repeat that? What the desecration of the host was?
I see. Yeah, Jews were accused of sneaking into churches at night and like stabbing the wafers, the communion
Right.
wafers,
Mhm.
in a way that would, I don't know, it said like, um, imitate the crucifixion. But the idea being that because this is a time of still where the whole Christian world ostensibly believes in transubstantiation, they're
Mhm.
not just like crumbling the crackers, they are stabbing Jesus
Mhm.
again. And I say again because, of course, that was also taught then that Jews killed Jesus.
Right.
Um, and that was a huge source of violence, was these accusations together that Jews committed deicide, and they continue to commit deicide every week when they come in and stab our crackers.
Mhm. And this occurred where now? In Spain or in Germany or where?
Throughout a lot of medieval Europe.
Mhm.
It happened in Spain, France, Germany. There was a lot of Jewish life that we have record of that time is in like the Rhineland area, sort of between France and Germany.
Mhm.
Um, so I don't know. In Jewish texts, it's just called Ashkenaz. I'm not sure which country officially that would be, but um, yeah, that's where a lot of the things that we have record of from that time period comes from that area.
Mhm.
Anything else? Okay. Um, okay. See, already new dudes, new events on this timeline. The epicenter moves west. Okay, so Al-Fasi, or the Rif, Rabbi Isaac Al-Fasi of Morocco, creates the first condensation and codification of the Jewish law. And Rabbi Zerachaya Halevi writes the critique of the code. The Rif also has a lot of commentary on I shouldn't say a lot. He is one of the commentators sometimes offered in like Talmud study. Um the Rashi, okay, we talked about Rashi, Ibn Ezra, the start of the First Crusade. So this is one of the things that I mentioned. It wasn't in the PowerPoint, but again, just a time of widespread violence against Jews as early as 1096. That just, it was a very dangerous time for Jews. Like the entire city of Mainz was Judenrein. Jerusalem captured by the Crusaders, all Jews in the city killed in 1099. captured from the Muslims, who forced Jews to like wear funny hats and pay a tax for not being Muslim, but allowed them to continue to live in their holy city and practice Judaism freely. So just as like a point of comparison here. Then we've got Maimonides, we talked about him. Simultaneously, Saladin leading the Muslims in the fight against the Crusaders. So the Crusades continue on through all of this period. Expulsions from parts of Germany. So during this time period is not a unified country, and that's where I get tripped up with these things like the Rhineland that Rashi refers to as Ashkenaz. Like, I'm not clear on, Germany was all these different little nobilities and not a unified country. That, you're right, there was like Bohemia and Bavaria and all of these. So I'm not sure what terms to use there. But some of those little nobility, feudal states or whatever, expelled the Jews. It was, like I said, a place of a lot of violence from the Crusaders coming east. And the accusations of the host and blood libels. Rabbeinu Yaakov, oh, does somebody have a question? No, that was me. Okay. Rabbeinu Yaakov Tam and the Baalei HaTosafot become the central forces of Torah scholarship. Yaakov Tam is Rashi's grandson. And Baalei Tosafot, that's not a name. That's like a school of thought that followed Yaakov Tam. And so they are also in any Talmud study book where there'll be like, there's the Gemara in the middle and Rashi on one side and Tosafot on the other, and then like the footnotes or publisher notes or whoever else on the bottom. So Tosafot is and Yaakov Tam is essential. And sometimes they get kind of referred to as like, oh, they're all Rashi's grandchildren, but it's just because Tom was their leader. Rabbeinu Tam was their leader. Okay, Second Crusade, more Jews killed. That feels like that's Jewish history in a nutshell. More Jews killed. Almohades bring Islamic intolerance to Spain, fostering the spread of Spanish Jewish culture outside the borders of Spain, particularly in Provence, at the crossroads of Sephard and Ashkenaz. Provence, France had a pretty like unique Jewish culture that was it didn't quite fit into either Sephardi or Ashkenazi buckets as we would recognize them. The era of the Pietists of Germany. This is another one of the polemical kind of periods. Benjamin of Tudela travels throughout the world and writes Travels of Benjamin. This is a pretty good, I've only read like pieces of this and obviously in translation. But it's pretty interesting because he visits all these other Jewish communities and then writes home about them. And they're like, even though he's a Jew only visiting other Jews, they still can be kind of voyeuristic and like, oh, these Eastern Jews are so exotic. But it is interesting to see how they saw each other, how they like, that lens of the world. And as I said, especially because a lot of those communities that he visited didn't put out a lot of their own work that really like was uplifted by the rest of the Jewish community for whatever reason. So Benjamin of Tudela is like a lot of what we even know about Central Asian Jewish life of that time. I think he might be, no, never mind, that's too late. He's not the source of the Khazarian myth, but he visits that part of the world, the Khazars. 1186, Jews expelled from France. This didn't have the expulsion from England on here, did it? Would have been around here somewhere. 1096 maybe. Okay, expulsion from France. Saladin conquers Jerusalem and allows Jews back into the city. The Third Crusade, more Jews are killed. Richard the Lionhearted is king. Yehuda Halevi writes Kuzari and Hebrew poetry. Yehuda Halevi is like the best medieval poet. And he writes Hebrew poetry, and he also writes a lot of imagined histories about the Khazars. Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman writes commentaries on Tanakh and Talmud, studies Kabbalah. Lateran Council orders Jews to wear badge of shame. You can guess what that is. Book burnings, always a good idea. Ramban wins disputation against apostate Pablo Cristiani. That's a big deal to win disputation, because what's the phrase I'm trying to use? It was stacked against him. The odds were stacked against him. The thing was rigged. It was supposed to be, and he won anyway. So, pretty big deal. And Rabbeinu Yonah Gerona writes, the gates of repentance. It's a Machzor. It's not quite the same as the Machzor we still use, but it's what's based on, ours is based on that one. Jews expelled from England. Oh, 1290. Why did I think it was 1090? Maybe they were expelled more than once. Rabbi Levi ben Gershon invents Jacob's staff. I'll have to double check what that is. Then more Jews expelled from More of France. Poisoning and conspiracy libels against Jews during the Black Plague. So this was that they a lot of Jews didn't get the plague, partially because they were so segregated, and partially because they had such cleanliness rituals. And so because they didn't get it, that made them suspicious. And Christian communities accused them of poisoning wells and doing things like that, and to spread the plague. So there were pogroms and expulsions. Rabbeinu Asher fled from Germany to Toledo, where his son combined scholarship of Sephardi and Ashkenazi cultures in the Arba Turim code of law. Jews expelled from Provence, which is still more of France. These names are more who might be considered Rishonim, more great commentators, the Meiri, Ra'avad, and Radak. And these are also more acronyms. The Radak is Rabbi David Kimchi, who every time I see his name, I want to say kimchi, but that's Ibn Tibbons translates major works from Arabic to Hebrew. He also wrote this wonderful ethical will that is sort of the blueprint for Jewish ethical wills. Continuous insecurity in Europe with discriminations and expulsions. The Turks capture all of the land of Israel from the Muslims, creating the impetus for a small resurgence of Jewish settlement in Israel. But then Byzantium falls. First printing of Jewish books on the printing press. This is a big deal. Jews love books. So printing press, really a game changer. The Inquisition, Columbus. More Inquisition, Leonardo da Vinci. First printing of the Talmud by non-Jewish printer Daniel Bomberg. I don't think I ever realized that Daniel Bomberg wasn't Jewish because his name is Bomberg. But yeah, the printing of the Talmud. This was again a big deal to be able to have the Talmud like that, like in a book. Rashi script used for the first time in printing. Rashi never used Rashi script, by the way. Something publishers invented just to make rabbinical students cry. Fairly certain. This is also the beginning of the Reformation. So Luther writes the Jews and their lies, and advocates that if Jews don't convert, that it's okay to burn down synagogues with Jews inside them. So Kabbalists moved to Spain or to Sfat, Israel. Increase in immigration to Israel. It's not a huge increase. It's a time of, some migration, but it's nothing like what the end of the 1700s and throughout the 1800s sees. Shulchan Aruch we talked about in the Mapah. The Merchant of Venice is written even though Shakespeare has never met a Jew because they weren't allowed in England. Khmelnytsky pogroms, we talked about that. Shabbatai Tzvi. Okay, Spanish, Portuguese, Jews come to the New World. We didn't talk about this yet. It's a big deal. They were Sephardic Jews, but they came with the Dutch, and established the first Jewish community in the New World. Well, yeah, there were also crypto-Jewish communities in like South America, but they were still Catholic with like Jewish vestiges. So this is the first like intentionally Jewish community in the New World. But Stuyvesant doesn't want to let them in. They do it anyway. Their synagogue, I think the building still exists, but is a museum now somewhere in New York. And Baruch Spinoza writes philosophy, which is the forerunner of modern biblical criticism, and is excommunicated in Amsterdam. He's often referred to as like the first secular Jew. By our standards today, he's still pretty religious, actually, but what he said at the time was considered very heretical, and he was excommunicated. And I think this is just like the epitome of Jewish love of learning over everything else, that even though he was excommunicated and considered so heretical and so awful, we still read his book. Like, he's still part of the Jewish canon today. Like, it's recognized that it had so much merit and it was kept and passed on in Jewish communities. More of Shabbatai Tzvi, blah, blah, blah. No, we're not going to get any more of Jacob Frank in here, though. He's so weird. Okay. Baal Shem Tov. We talked about this. Rabbi Moses Chaim Luzzatto, or the Ramchal, systematizes Kabbalah into logical steps, making it accessible to laymen, and writes both ethical classics, Path of the Just, The Way of God, and plays and poetry. And then the Vilna Gaon. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, that's another, he begins Chabad as a branch of Hasidism. Volozhin. Okay. And that's that. Any other questions?
Rabbi Lizz,
Yes.
we've talked a great deal about interpretations of the Torah, and I got into a discussion with a young lady this past week who said, and I said, I'm Jewish, and she said, well, haven't you read Isaiah 53? And I thought to myself, yeah, okay, Isaiah 53, you took it, and justified Jesus.
Yeah.
But that begs the question, who wrote Isaiah 53? Who wrote the Torah?
Well, we talked about last time that Isaiah 53 is written by someone in exile. It's not written by the prophet Isaiah.
Mhm.
It's a second person writing in Isaiah's name. That I mean, the question of who wrote the Tanakh is a big one, and the answer is many, many people. The Torah can be broken up into 4 different authorship, but even those like aren't like 4 people, it's 4 schools of thought, and like God knows how many people actually wrote it, but there were 4 sets of sages. I'm not sure like what the right title would even be, but there were 4 groups of people that contributed to writing Tanakh and Joshua and Judges. Joshua and Judges are considered still like Deuteronomic, so the same author or the same school of authors that wrote Deuteronomy or wrote parts of Deuteronomy also wrote parts of Joshua and Judges. And then beyond that, like probably similarly, there are different schools of authors that were involved in writing the rest of the Tanakh. Some of it's like parts of Isaiah, like the first part of Isaiah is some of the oldest parts of the Tanakh that we have. Like there were scrolls found in Qumran, you know, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, of huge sections of Isaiah that are almost identical to what we have now. Even though they were written way before most of the manuscripts that like our Bibles are actually based on. So that indicates that Isaiah as we know it, especially like I said, the first half or whatever, the first up to 40 chapters, is incredibly old, and like written down soon after the prophet Isaiah actually lived, which was, you know, rare. A lot of stuff was oral. But then somebody else wrote the rest, and possibly even 2 other people wrote the rest of Isaiah. And we don't really know who. But also, as I said last time, you know, 2 weeks ago when we talked about this, it doesn't change how Jews read it. It's not like we're saying, oh, well, somebody else wrote it, so it's irrelevant. We're saying we don't even think it says what you think it says. So it's not like we're dismissing it because it's a different author. The traditional Jewish view is still to read it as though it is Isaiah, the whole book, even though linguistically we can see that there were definitely different layers to like this being put together, that this was not all written in the same time period of history. But that's not why we don't see Jesus in it. We don't see Jesus in it because we don't believe that that's what the words are saying, that there is a lot more metaphor and parable in Isaiah's prophecy, and the concept of Messiah before Christianity. I won't even say before Jesus, because what became of Jesus's messianism after his death is very different even than what his followers would have expected of him, because the concept of Messiah was not a divine person or not a divine being. It was God's chosen to recreate the monarchy, to reinstate David's line. It wasn't about like the end times or that kind of stuff until much later. There became more Jewish views on that as that sort of became the accepted idea of what a Messiah will be, or what a messianic age will be. But like historically, when we read Isaiah, what he's talking about, like in his time period, what Isaiah thinks the Messiah is is just a person who's going to return Jewish autonomy, and like security in our ownership of the land, of the Holy Land. And so when he says things like, the lion shall lay down with the lamb, and like whatever, he's not talking about a literal like era of peace on earth. He's talking about like things will feel right to me. My people will be happy. Like, and so the same thing that in this like suffering servant, because being a king is hard. He's not talking about this concept of like Jesus and the crucifixion. Like, it's not a prophecy of those types of things. He's prophesying that a belabored servant of God will return Jewish autonomy, and safety in the Holy Land.
But why is there stuff about somebody being slaughtered and all that stuff? And again, it's almost like it is saying the crucifixion will occur, and the crucifixion will occur, and then Christians taking that passage to justify Jesus as the person who is identified in Isaiah 53. Unless I'm quoting the wrong passage of Isaiah.
I don't know. I still see this as
allegorical and metaphorical.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do I. Yeah.
I don't think it's talking like this idea of the suffering servant and these things that will befall him are not. I don't think this is really about one person. Or like a person. You know what I mean? Like he's talking about this concept of like of God's chosen, and like that it's hard to lead, and that like people are cruel, like all of like he had to face that all of the prophet he Isaiah, all of the prophets were ridiculed and put down by the people. So so that's what I think Isaiah is talking about. And there are lots of if you go on Safaria, you can find some of the Rishonim that we talked about today and what they had to say about these passages and how traditional Judaism reads them. And it will relate back to like the timeline and stuff that we talked, all of the things that we learned about today from Jewish history. Okay. All right. Well, we've lost everyone else, but it was good to chat, to finish this up with you, Mario, and I'll see you next week.
Okay.
All right.
Bye. Bye-bye, Rabbi Lizz.